The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me for this evening's webinar all about how to help anxious children. Now I'm going to talk you through some of the logistical elements of being on the webinar, but before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, I just wonder, for those of you who are listening in front of your computer, would you be able to ping me over a hello in the questions box so that I know that you can hear me okay? Please can you tell me when we submit the questions we have? I will do that. How to help an anxious child start school? We may get to that. Okay, so we're in the question zone already. I was saving that right for the very end. But I can see that everybody can hear me, which is great stuff. What I'm going to do in just a moment is share my screen with you, because I'm going to take you through some slides which correspond with the PDF document that I sent you out probably earlier on today. But just so that you've got some idea of how the webinar works, so this is recorded, which means that if for any reason your internet connection goes a little bit wobbly, it doesn't matter, because I'll be sending you the recording tomorrow. So you can always catch up or listen again at a later stage if you need to. So let me give you the format of how it's going to work today. I'm going to take you through a whole ton of information about how I've developed NLP type techniques for working with children and young people in the area of anxiety. I'm not going to be able to cover everything. We've only got 90 minutes, but I will do the very best I can and cram in as much information as humanly possible. I will pause every now and again just to see what questions are coming in, and I might postpone some of those questions because they might actually get covered during the rest of the webinar. And then we'll have a more formal Q&A session at the very end. So I've put by 15 minutes at the end for me to go through any other questions that come up at that stage. So what I'm going to do right now, if you haven't received the PDF document, I'm not going to send it to you right now because obviously the webinar started, but it will come out to you tomorrow when you get the recording, because I'll be sending it out again then. Basically the email that you got today confirming the webinar, that had the PDF document in, if you wanted to quickly go back and see if you've got it there. All right, so I'm going to start sharing my screen with you now. If you are listening in via the telephone, obviously you won't be able to see my screen, but as I say, it does correspond with the document that I've sent out to you today, and we're videoing, so you will be able to watch all of this again a little bit later. So I just want to double check now that I'm sharing my screen. For those of you who have a screen in front of you, can you just ping me over a yes in the questions box so that I know that you can see my screen? And then I'm going to turn it into presenter mode. Excellent, thank you so much. All right, so let's hit play and get going. Okay, so welcome first of all, everybody. This is the first webinar in a series of 4. So there are 3 more webinars taking place over the next 3 weeks. I know the majority of you have signed up for all 4 webinars, and that's brilliant. Let me just introduce myself to get things started. So my name is Gemma Bailey. I'm the Director of NLP for Kids. I oversee our training and the licensee team who stay with NLP for Kids beyond that and become our practitioners, who then go out into the world and exercise these NLP techniques with children, teachers and families. My background is nursery nursing, so I'm a qualified nursery nurse. I worked with the health visiting team as a community nursery nurse a long time ago. I ran private day nurseries, I nannied, I worked in schools, so pretty much every kind of genre of child-related care or education I've had some experience in. I trained as an NLP practitioner, master practitioner and a trainer. I previously to that actually trained as a hypnotherapist, and I'm a trainer of hypnotherapy too. So NLP for Kids is really a combination of my children related skills colliding with my NLP related skills. So that's where NLP for Kids comes from. In terms of how our team works, so we have practitioners who are dotted all around the UK. We've also trained people overseas, although we haven't actually got any licensed practitioners overseas at the moment. Essentially, we go out into schools, we deliver workshops for children, teachers, and parents, and we also work with them on a one-to-one coaching basis as well. That could be done through the schools. Sometimes it happens in our local communities where we are running private therapy practices, and parents might get in touch because their child has a very specific problem that they would like us to help them with. We also run workshops in our local communities, and we work with a whole host of other professionals who have some influence over children and their families in the world. So in terms of how you can be involved with NLP for Kids, there's a few things I just want to mention very briefly before we get into the webinar content. Firstly, doing stuff like this. So going through little nuggets of NLP for Kids type training with us is a great way to kind of whet your appetite and ultimately to start sharing the skills that we have, because my philosophy is that whilst what we do is great, it's only great if we can touch as many different lives with it as possible. And so by having you guys on this webinar tonight and the subsequent webinars to come, it means that our reach becomes wider, and that's definitely a very good thing. Also, you might be listening in because you have a child, or you're perhaps overseeing a child who has some kind of anxiety-related issue. Now, you may not necessarily get everything you need to help that child completely eradicate that anxiety by the end of the webinar today. However, you do now know where you can find a practitioner who would be able to help you. So ultimately, if you don't have all the answers by the end of the webinar this evening, then get in touch. I will let you know where your nearest practitioner is, and you can see where to go from there. So what you're going to get from this webinar series is a whole host of different hints, tips, and techniques that you'll be able to take out into the world and start putting into effective use with young people and their families. A lot of the stuff that we share is actually quite appropriate for adults as well. I also run NLP training for grown-ups, and I very often pitch it to grown-ups from the same perspective as I would if I were working with children, which leads many adults to say, wow, you explain it in a way that makes it sound so simple. I've never heard of it done like that before. So you'll probably get some borrowing benefits for yourself from being part of this webinar series. I don't doubt it. So after tonight, there will be an upload of this recording, and that will be sent out to you tomorrow. So you'll have access to all of the stuff that we're covering tonight from tomorrow. You can have full-time access to that as many times as you want to access it. That will apply to the subsequent webinars as well. So if you've perhaps only signed up for tonight's webinar and you get to the end of it and think, actually, I'd really quite like to do the others, you can go ahead and get yourself booked on to the additional 3, and the same principle will apply. So all of the webinars will be recorded. And before we really kick off into the topic for this evening, looking at anxiety, it would be really useful for me to know who you are, because I propositioned that this webinar would be suitable for both parents and professionals who are working with young people. Now, some of you might be wearing both of those hats, but some of you might be here just because, you know, you are specifically a parent or you are a professional working with young people and you want to get some extra tools in your toolbox. So just in that questions box for me, can you just ping over a little note and let me know, are you a parent or a professional? And if you're a professional, what kind of a professional are you? Are you a teacher, a healthcare worker? Are you part of a young offenders team? Let me just have a look and see who we've got here. Parents and girls self-esteem coach, that's very specific. Okay, parents and girls. Teacher, lovely. Hypnotherapist, super. Teaching assistant, brilliant. Young people's counsellor in schools, brilliant. Learning mentor, lovely. Okay, good stuff. And some NLP coaches, a couple of you wearing both hats. NNEB, that's the same as me, wonderful. We've got an art psychotherapist, excellent. What a real mixed bag of people we've got here. Some more for the parents, NLP for kids practitioners, lovely, good stuff. That's really good. Thanks for sharing that information. It's useful for me because when we come to do something like this again, it tells me who I need to market this to. And I see Amanda sent over a message there saying, what does NLP stand for? So some of you are really, really new to this. Let me just tick that box for you because that's important. So NLP stands for Neuro Linguistic Programming, which is quite a fancy name and it doesn't really help you to understand what it is at all. So neuro relating to the brain, linguistic relating to your language, and programming being the patterns of behaviour that you consistently follow. There is no one thing that describes what NLP is. It's a series of different techniques, different methodologies. Part of it's about attitude and mindset. So it's made up of lots of different things. We're going to be covering just one or two of those things today, but there's a whole repertoire of different skills for you to be able to learn. Coming along to the subsequent webinars will obviously expose you to even more of them. All right, so what we're going to be looking at now is the big fat why. I always like to start anything I do with looking at the reason why we're doing it and the reason why this thing actually exists. So the question here is, why do children get anxious? Now, an interesting thing occurred to me actually just a couple of days ago. So right now, as I speak to you, I'm in Bulgaria because I have a place over here when I get too much work to do, it's the best place for me to come to because there are no interruptions whatsoever. And when I got the taxi to where I am staying, I was speaking to the taxi driver, and the taxi driver was talking to me about, what he's done in his studies and his life so far. And it was a really interesting conversation because there's quite a big difference between the culture in the UK and, other Western countries and how things are over here in Bulgaria. Bulgaria is a really poor country. And, this was certainly reflected in what he was saying to me. And what was really interesting was he was telling me about, 60% of people don't pay their taxes over here. There's this problem, there's that problem, there's problems with the roads, the government's still a bit corrupt. So all of these different issues he was highlighting, which caused me to say, would you ever consider living in another country? Because you know how, certainly for those of us based in the UK, it's quite an effectively organised system. I know we would moan about it sometimes, but actually we have quite an organised system in place in terms of how we live our lives. In fact, there's quite a lot of layers of complexity around most of the things that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. So I said to him, would you ever consider living in another country? And he said, no, of course not. Excuse my bad Bulgarian accent, by the way. No, of course not. And I said, well, why not? There's all these challenges here. And he said, because life is very simple here. And everybody know where they stand and what they need to do. And it's very simple. And I was thinking about this webinar and I thought, well, that's really interesting. Now, I don't know what the stats are for mental health around anxiety for young people in Bulgaria. But it did make me think, you know what? We live quite complicated lives, and the more stuff we have to think about and the more layers of complexity there are, I wonder if that would make us more predisposed to being anxious. So, just ponder that one for a moment. But one of the key reasons why children or young people might start suffering with anxiety is because it's a learned behaviour. What I mean by that is that there is a family member, usually a parent, who also displays anxiety. So they do the behaviour of anxiety, and the young person has grown up witnessing that. And as a result of growing up and seeing it, it becomes a bit of a default setting for them. There may have, however, been a one-time event that caused a habitual response to any perceived stressful stimuli. Now let me just break that down. So there's a one-time event that happened. Perhaps there is no anxiety in the family whatsoever, but this one-time event that was incredibly stressful caused them to be anxious. And because it was so intense, it meant that later on, if they were to encounter a similar situation, so a similar kind of stimulus, they now, as a default setting, go into that state of anxiety. And they